World War II was the biggest federal government expenditure in the history of the US. And it came right after the Great Depression, the most miserable time in US history. During the Great Depression, there was no money to be taxed. There was no money to be borrowed to fund World War II. So if taxes were the thing that we used to pay for World War II, that was not it during World War II. If that were the case, we would be speaking in German today, right? So how did we pay for that massive, expensive program? It wasn't by taxing anybody or borrowing from anybody. It was by getting Congress to vote and approve the spending on World War II. The concern at the time was not finding the money, as Stephanie Kelton says. It was about finding the votes in Congress, and it was unanimous. We need to fight this thing. And then the question was, where do we find the actual resources, productive capacity to build tanks and airplanes and soldiers and workers to produce all the war materials? And the physical raw materials like rubber and steel and all the equipment needed for World War II. That was the real challenge. So the concern was, do we have enough productive capacity? And the answer was yes, but only if we actually dedicate some of Detroit, for example, was producing consumer goods and convert it to producing military equipment, which we did. Do we have enough people to work second and third shift? The answer was yes, if we bring women in the labor force, if we bring older people back in the labor force and younger people in the labor force. And we did. We managed to mobilize real resources, scarce resources, labor resources. So that was done. We produced the tanks and airplanes, and then comes the risk of inflation. So now we've paid those people decent wages, and it's a free country. They take their wages and they go out and spend it the way they want. Maybe they wanted to buy a new house, a new car, whatever entertainment people wanted to buy, textiles, clothing. The challenge was that we actually didn't have any new houses for them to buy or any new cars for that matter. We didn't have consumer goods to provide to those workers. So what did we do to prevent the risk of inflation? We said, we're going to raise taxes a little bit, quote unquote, to pay for the war, even though the war was already paid for. So we raised taxes during the war, not before the war. And we started selling US government bonds to those same workers that we just paid decent wages to. We sold them freedom bonds. We sold them war bonds to sort of capitalize on the patriotic mood of the nation, which says, buy these war bonds. In other words, please postpone your consumption. Don't buy that new house. Don't buy that new car. Save your money. We, the federal government, promise to pay you back plus interest. When? After the war, which was exactly what happened. People abstained from consumption because there wasn't anything to consume anyway. And that's how we dealt with the risk of inflation. And right after the war, we paid them back plus interest, and they went on a shopping spree. They bought houses and cars and furniture and all kinds of things. And then we faced another risk of inflation, which is all that new spending, that pent up demand, to the point where we had to convert companies like Boeing, which was producing airplane engines, and Boeing started producing furniture for consumers who were building new homes and buying new furniture and all kinds of stuff. So we learned from that experience how to fund a massively expensive and difficult program without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country, without turning into a communist nation. So we know how to do this. And then we learned how to manage the post-war risk of inflation. So that's one example to show you that the federal government actually doesn't need to collect tax revenues in order to fund these massive programs, but it needs to use its taxation and its bond sales in order to manage the risk of inflation, stabilize interest rates, and stabilize other aspects of the economy. But it's got nothing to do with the actual funding of the program. So if we take that example and apply it to a Medicare for all type of scenario, it's about the real resources. And it's about once we pay people decent wages and benefits in that healthcare industry, what will they do with their money? They're going to go out on a shopping spree. They're going to buy houses and cars and entertainment. Do we as a US economy have enough capacity for new houses and new cars and all that? If we do, there is no inflation. If we don't, then we should be building more housing and more energy and transportation systems so that we provide the additional services and tame the risk of inflation. And if we have abusive market power in the healthcare industry and pharmaceuticals, then we should tackle it because that's the source of inflation. That abusive market power is not going to go away if we look the other way and pretend like it's about spending more or spending less. So that's really the key here. In terms of a more recent example that all of us here are probably familiar with, it's the COVID relief spending. When COVID hit and President Trump at the time said, we're going to, have COVID relief for all consumers, $2.2 trillion. That vote in the Senate and in Congress was not, there was no debate about who are we going to tax $2.2 trillion or who are we going to borrow from. It was just a national priority. We're going to do it. And we did it. And then the concern was, do we have enough productive capacity to produce enough food and toilet paper and Netflix accounts and entertainment to keep people safe at home? Do we have enough PPE equipment? Do we have enough nurses? That was the real challenge of COVID. Do we have vaccines? Do we have research and development? So it wasn't not having the money. It was not having the things that will keep us alive and safe and decent quality of life. It's always that focus that should be our priority, the real side of the economy, not about finding the money. And yet today you'll hear people blaming this current inflation that we're seeing on that COVID relief spending. We're blaming poor children and the unemployed during the COVID period. We're saying they're the ones causing inflation. So we need to reduce government spending and raise interest rates, when the actual sources of inflation right now have nothing to do with domestic spending. They have something to do with disruption of supply chains globally. It has to do with abusive market power that corporate CEOs are blatantly telling us on live television, we're raising prices because we can. And yet we have people in Congress who are turning a blind eye and pretending like they didn't hear it, when they have the power to regulate corporate power and abuse. And yet we hear the narrative that blames the poor for this inflation, as opposed to going after corporations, going after the logistical disruptions that we have, shipping containers, the shortages related to raw materials that are affected by sanctions, obviously energy prices that have nothing to do with US consumers, have something to do with global conflict in Europe and things like that. So it's very important for us to call their bluff when they blame inflation on working class people and use that excuse to say, we can't afford Medicare, we can't afford Green New Deal, we can't afford this, that, and the other, unless we tax the hell out of you, the middle class, to pay for it. And MMT says, no. You don't need to tax us to spend on this. And by the way, even taxing the rich and oligarchs is not because we need their money or their permission. It's because we need to tax them to decarbonize. We need to tax them to reduce the inequality, to reduce their abusive market power, to reduce the power of the oligarchs. Those are very important reasons to tax the hell out of them, but not because we need their money to fund Medicare for all. So we decouple the taxing and spending, and we completely change the narrative about what needs to be done on a political level and on an economic level.